It's a bit of a running joke at this point to argue about the seasonality of media. What makes a movie a Christmas movie? Is The Thing a Christmas movie because there's snow and the researchers give the monster the gift of their biomass? What makes something Halloween-y? Kind of by default, anything labeled horror is auto-include, right? But what about the stuff that isn't necessarily trying to scare you, but is still Halloween-y? Aside from explicitly Halloween-themed scary godmother-pilled non-horror movies, what non-horror media are you allowed to consume during Halloween that won't offend Jack Skellington and make him hide razor blades in your apples? If you look at a sampling of Halloween costumes, it's kind of all over the place. Truly the Smash Brothers of holidays. But, just like Smash, there's also a core group of archetypes that make up the seasonal identity most people intuitively identify with Halloween. I'd say that core group is largely made out of first, fall harvest aesthetics, classic horror media's characters and tropes, some watered-down occult, superstitious, and supernatural imagery, some common phobias, and music that goes... and also surf rock. Rock Lobster is a Halloween song. Loosely using these categories, you can sort of ballpark the Halloweeniness of any given piece of media. Some categories matter more than others, and some contextualize other things, making them Halloweeny when they otherwise wouldn't be. Devil May Cry has all kinds of demon and cult stuff, and even skeletons. But it's not contextualized in a way that feels Halloweeny at all. Same with SMT, and that series even has a jack-o'-lantern man, but it still feels like it's squarely in the taboo category for October.
You think this is funny? You think this is a joke?
Meanwhile, Metal Slug 3? Zombies, mummies, Little Shop of Horrors things, hokey-looking aliens and multiple BGMs with the sound. Yes, it absolutely passes. Sonic Adventure 2? Only Pumpkin Hill. Otherwise, you have to close your eyes anytime Pumpkin Hill isn't on screen.
I can't see a thing.
Painkiller. Look at this graveyard. Listen to this music. Look at this skeleton. Check out the novelty rubber grabby arms. Check out this spinning green witch. Very clearly Halloween game. Sorry, I don't make the rules. But aside from being objectively Halloween adjacent, what is Painkiller? It's an arena shooter, pretty similar to something like Serious Sam or the Doom reboot in style. You go around from walled-off combat room to walled-off combat room, mulching hordes of monsters, while bunny hopping at 60 miles per hour and looking for secrets. You play as Daniel, a cool leather jacket wearing guy who, one night, while getting lost in his leather jacket wearing cool leather babe wife's cool leather eyes, while driving, slams into the funny anime vehicle. Now he's trapped in purgatory, trying to work his way into heaven so he can see his wife again. The story doesn't matter at all, but it is delivered in these really off-putting cutscenes that make me grin. They're like the 3D animation equivalent of the Zelda CDI cutscenes. The game's split up into a series of instance levels, organized into chapters, each chapter ending with a boss fight. To actually access any of these levels, you're gonna have to learn to operate this devilish gem compass. I took a class on user interfaces, and they pretty much explicitly said not to make stuff like this, but they're wrong. This thing's really fun to jack around with. The game's developers, People Can Fly, went with a pretty loose interpretation of Purgatory. Stages are thematically kinda all over the place. Sometimes Purgatory is spooky looking, sometimes it's an opera house. Sometimes it's an asylum, occasionally it's the siege of Leningrad. I guess Purgatory can be whatever you want it to be. It's just like a supernatural version of one of those Chinese ghost cities that are like mock versions of real-life locations, except it's filled with demons. The game's location variety goes a very long way in keeping things interesting, each level presenting you with new environments that are often totally different to ones you've already played. Along with constantly being presented with new stages, you're also consistently introduced to entirely new sets of enemies that thematically fit the environments. Skeletons in crypts, bayonet-charging undead soldiers in the military base, and Ghost Riders in Venice. I'm gonna start complaining.
Face off.
As varied as the locations and enemies are, I do kinda wish the ones more towards the tail end of the game would start getting more outlandish. There's no real progression of wackiness and spookiness. Some of the final stages have you bouncing around a dock fighting longshoremen with Staclosian phenotypes. The different enemies also do stuff. Sometimes their abilities are pretty straightforward. Cultists will throw their weapons and then have an aneurysm. And soldiers will sometimes fire their weapons and toss gas grenades, but other times enemies' abilities get kinda wacky. A couple of them have actions that require a second demon to function, like the Ghost Riders will grab hostages to use as meat shields. And I know there's a couple of enemies that can resurrect the lesser ones. There's something about the proportions, animations, and interactions between the enemies that give Painkiller's demons a really strong personality and presence you rarely see in NPCs. It makes them really fun to shoot. There's these angrier than usual skeleton men that have glaives that have glowy bits on the non-sharp side. If you touch that part of it, you'll get slowed down for a few seconds. The enemies will sometimes swing that end of the weapon to try to purposely slow you down, but you can also just run into it yourself. The hitbox for it is always on, even if the weapon's on the ground. It's a small detail, but by having the weapon function this way, it feels like it's an actual weapon being wielded by a character and not just part of an NPC's hitbox. Like I mentioned, the animations and poses are also considerably more in-your-face than most games. Like the Necro Giant's big swinging arms that cover more distance than there is in a lot of other games' entire maps. Or for instance, the amputees in the Insane Asylum, whose proportions and pose really lean out at you. The whole game ends up feeling like a Doom wad where you're shooting fat Elverts trying to run through your TV. One of my favorite animations is another one from the Necro Giant where he summons spikes out of the ground and he counts out each spike on his fingers.
1, 2, 3.
The game's environments have a similar presence, or whatever you want to call it, achieved by the haphazard and frankly irresponsible inclusion of assloads of physics objects everywhere, all of which have collision with the player. Half-Life 2 came out the same year as this, and it gets all sort of praised for its little frou-frou physics puzzles, but Gabe was really holding out on us. Half-Life is a physics microdose, Painkiller is a physics overdose. Pretty much anything that isn't nailed to the level geometry can be pushed around and climbed on, including debris from explosions, and most importantly ragdolls. Daniel can clamber up pretty much any incline in the game if you're persistent and tap the spacebar long enough. This allows you to fairly consistently use enemy corpses to boost your jumps and get a little bit more airtime. Also, enemies' previously mentioned propensity to lean tends to make them very good ramps. If you fly at one at even a moderate speed, you'll often get launched upward. This isn't even a bug, this is the movement system, and there are secrets that require you to exploit this. There's this borderline experimental part of the game where you have to take a ski lift elevator, but you can't get inside of it. You have to ride on top of it, and it's a rigid body attached to a string. You don't fight anything during this part, you just have to maintain balance and not upset the physics engine. It's hilarious, and I don't think I've ever seen another shooter do something like this. The game's got a fairly unique selection of weapons that, generally speaking, feel very good to use. Most of them are like 2 separate guns stapled together, but the default melee you start with is like 4 weapons stapled together. It really is less of a melee weapon and more of just a weapon that doesn't use ammo. Firstly, the primary fire schwacks. Anything within its effective range will receive a constant barrage of damage. Getting up close is often very risky though. The secondary fire will launch off the weapon's blade. Hitting an enemy with it deals a good bit of damage, and if you get right up into an enemy's face, you can pretty easily spam it for a lot of quick damage. I really like how it yanks enemies towards you, it feels like having a magic lasso. If you shoot the weapon's head off and lodge it into a wall, you can then point the nublet you still have in your hand at the blade, and it'll connect both parts with a beam that damages anything that passes through it. It takes a little bit of planning to figure out how to use this well, but it can clean up big groups of enemies without using any ammo. And finally, if you hit secondary fire while using the primary fire, you'll launch the blade off in its schwacking state, which will deal damage while passing through enemies. Unfortunately, the blade's a bit slow and finicky. It seems to only work if you hit stuff dead to the center, but it deals good damage if you can pull it off. But moving on, as far as actual guns, you've got a shotgun that feels a lot like the TF2 scattergun with a freeze ray secondary that'll turn bullet sponges into one-shottable statues. There's a stake gun with projectiles that become more damaging the further they travel, and it's also got a underbarreled grenade launcher, which seems like a weird combo at first, especially because if you try to use the grenade launcher raw, it kind of feels bad and you'll often hurt yourself with it. To get the most out of the secondary fire, tee up a nade and then nail it with a stake to send the grenade flying. It'll go much further than it would normally go, and it'll explode on impact instead of having to wait for a fuse timer. Utilizing this properly is fun as hell, and I swear it makes the grenade deal more damage. At least it feels like it does. After that, there's a kunai launcher that feels kind of trash, honestly, but it's combined with a lightning gun. This weapon has a trick too. If you fire the lightning gun, and then press the primary fire at the same time, you'll shoot out a metal rod that'll start zapping anything close to it. This attack consumes a lot of secondary ammo, but it can thoroughly delete entire hordes if you're using it right. The last weapon in the base game levels is a rocket launcher minigun combo that's pretty straightforward. But in the Battle Out of Hell expansion levels, there is a sniper rifle adjacent spike gun with an underbarreled ball bearing flinger, and a high caliber assault rifle with a flamethrower. The rifle's able to spawn explosive barrels if you do the shuriken gun's input, but it seems like a kind of a waste of ammo to me. Most enemies will die to afterburn if you catch them on fire at all, so it's much more ammo efficient just to spritz a crowd once or twice. And you want to be ammo efficient with this because the flame ammo is very hard to come by. Painkiller has a fairly standard health system for an arena shooter. You've got HP and armor that mitigates HP damage taken. Health is regained by either finding glowy Healy orbs in the levels or collecting souls from enemies. Souls will spawn after an enemy's corpse disappears once it's spent a few seconds sitting around, and each soul grants you a single hit point back, which doesn't sound like a lot, but there's a lot of enemies per level, so it adds up. Souls also have a secondary function. Once you collect 66 souls, you'll enter Demon Mode, which is an incredibly OP temporary super state where you just will everything into giblets. You do have some control over when you actually pop this, but it requires you to get around 65 souls and then just kind of stop collecting them, which feels unintuitive and bad, but you get used to it after some playing. Demon Mode isn't the only super state in the game either. Each stage has an associated challenge. Some of them are more of a chore than others, but on completion of a level's challenge you'll be awarded a tarot card that grants you a perk. You've got 5 slots to place these cards, 2 passive bonuses, and 3 to make your own Build-A-Bear Roid Rage. Each card has an associated cost to slot in that you pay in the gold you collect from destroying props in the environments. The active ability cards grant things like increased damage or slowing time, and all the ones you have equipped are always activated all at the same time. You're only allowed to do this once per stage though, unless you take the passive cards that grant additional uses of your gold cards. The whole system feels like the fun of turning on hacks without any of the guilt since it's part of the game. The rules say I get to cheat, sorry. Anyway, Painkiller is a lot of fun. It's probably one of my favorite shooters. Once you get the rhythm of bunny hopping down, you can zoom around at comical speeds, pogoing off the ragdolls of demons, and launching yourself off physics objects. The game does a really good job of presenting you with new locations constantly, as well as showing you thematically fitting enemies to keep things fresh. And the selection of exotic and goofy weapons feels uniquely rewarding to learn and properly utilize. As much as I recommend the game, there's some aspects to it that I imagine will turn some people off. I'll just start listing stuff that people might get filtered by. For starters, the game hitches a lot.
Stop all the downloading!
Most encounters are just one enemy type spammed 50 times. The bosses sometimes have annoying puzzles, and so do some of the levels. There's also some really bizarre difficulty spikes, a lot of which are concentrated in the Battle Out of Hell levels. Specifically, Leningrad is brutal, and the end of the Dead City stage is probably one of the most obnoxious parts of a video game ever. But anyway, winding over, if you want to try Painkiller, get Black Edition. Hopefully it runs okay for you. It's an old game and has the eternal Eastern European developer debuff, so mileage may vary.